Will history repeat itself when the U.S. leaves Afghanistan? The Taliban continue to advance ahead of a drawdown that could be finalized in a matter of weeks. Perhaps, some say in Washington, even days. The insurgencies even reached the gates of Kunduz. That's in the north, far from its traditional base in the south. As we will illustrate in an excerpt from our exclusive report, the Taliban already control vast swathes of the countryside. Is their return to power inevitable? Does it signal an end to women's rights and civil liberties, as was the case in pre-9/11 Afghanistan? How to offer an alternative that will federate Afghans? If Kabul in 2021 is doomed to resemble Saigon and the collapse of the South Vietnam regime in 1975, there's a big difference. Communist Vietnam never harbored militants who planted bombs on 5 continents. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking what is in fact next for Afghanistan. And joining us, France 24 Kabul correspondent Margot Ben, who is part of the team that put together that report for Reporters, our investigative news magazine. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Also in our company, Afghan journalist Mortaza Beiboudi, who's just back. Nice to see you. Thanks for being with us here in the studio.
Thank you.
From Washington, Christine Fair, professor of security studies at Georgetown University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And from Newport, Rhode Island, Jacqueline Hazelton, assistant professor of defense and security strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, just as the U.S. packs up, some 5,000 families reportedly fleeing Kunduz over the weekend. This in the wake of last week's capture of the nearby town of Shir Khan Bandar. That's the main border crossing to Tajikistan. And while that was happening, Mortaza Beiboudi, you were further west in the city of Mazar-e Sharif. Tell us what we're seeing in these images here.
Yeah, we see Afghan militia, ordinary people, simple people. They took guns and go fight against Taliban while Taliban were outside of the city the night before. The civilians, ordinary people, myself I'm Afghan, Franco-Afghan. I arrived to France 5 years ago. I talked to them, why you're taking guns and going there? We have military, we have Afghan military. Why? They don't trust Afghan military, first of all. I mean, they're thinking that they are not well trained because we lost this month only more than 650 security forces, this month only, and more than 1,200 civilians have been killed in Afghanistan only this month. And that's why, I mean, people, they are going to fight against Taliban with the order of politicians. I mean, parliament members, of course. These images we see in Mazar-e-Sharif, only one parliament member gathered more than 2,000 civilian, ordinary people took guns, and they are paid for 4 days fight, $120.
So is it a return to before 2001 when you had the Taliban in power in Kabul, and then you had the Northern Alliance, you had groups that were fighting against the Taliban? Yeah,
we'll see. I mean, today, I mean, U.S. Must take the responsibility of this withdrawal. They are leaving now, okay, but this responsibility should be taken by U.S. Army and U.S. government because now we see the progress. We don't have to forget the achievement of women, the civilians. We need to listen to civilians, first of all. Politicians, Afghan politicians, other politicians, U.S. soldiers, everyone, and they are living in bubbles. They are living in the bulletproof cars. They are living in armed houses. But who suffer more? They are civilians. They are living in every day, students going to schools, women going to work. Also, 20 years of achievement. We don't have to forget this. And now, when we see the Taliban, Daesh striking every day in Kabul, the capital, other city, they took more than 20 districts of Afghanistan. It's scary.
So what do you do, Christine Fair? What should be the response of the international community?
So it's really kind of complicated, right? Because we've put ourselves in such a position that it's difficult to re-optimize from here. I think my biggest frustration is that we have We tried to experiment with what we do in Afghanistan, but we've never had a Pakistan policy. And in fact, the current situation, this defeat was quite frankly purchased on the installment plan because of the way in which we treated Pakistan. We've more or less treated Pakistan as a partner, when in fact Pakistan has been undermining us all the way. So whether or not we have any significant troop presence in Afghanistan after the Biden policy is fully effectuated, if we don't have a Pakistan policy that puts very stern punishments upon Pakistan should it continue to support the violence that its proxies are perpetrating, we're going to find ourselves, I think, in a situation that's quite reminiscent of the 1990s. Already, it's happening that different ethnic communities are assembling their own militias because they are afraid that they're not going to have anyone else to protect their communities once the United States leaves. So, and this is, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let me bring in Margot Ben on this. When you're on the ground, is it a question of militias that get foreign backing? We know that, the Taliban, the charge that the Pakistanis support them. There are other hardline groups that are allegedly supported by India. So is it about foreign powers?
Well, it's as much about foreign powers as it is about militias that are actually homegrown in Afghanistan. The worrying situation right now is the multiplicity and the multiplication, indeed, of militias in Afghanistan. You have pre-existing militias, some that were actually defunct, that used to function during the civil war of the 1990s. And those militias, those people are basically constituents of former warlords who used to be in power or vie for power, in the 1990s. And so you have all these people, all these constituents that are ready to take up arms and who still answer to those former warlords, those who are still alive. And then you have other militias, some of them, pro-government militias who were coined by the U.S., who are indeed funded by the U.S., who are aligned with the government and who kind of supplement the government troops and the police in far-out postings. So you have these types of militias that kind of protect their villages, protect their localities. And then you have the government that's kind of the central government in Kabul, who in the past few days, about a week ago, I believe, proposed to support these militias, who promised some of these pre-existing militias to some funding and some support from the central government. This is also quite worrying because the central government cannot already fund its own army because of corruption and lack of funds. Army and police are not receiving their salaries, or they're receiving it very late, and that means a lot of desertions, a lot of disgruntled soldiers who are not able to do their job correctly, who often don't even have functional weapons. And so now we have a central government who's proposing to arm and to fund and to pay more militias that are essentially uncontrollable and who answer to very local either warlords or commanders. And then you indeed have other local authorities who are already proposing to defend their districts, their provinces. Again, very recently, I believe it was the provincial governor of Bamyan who promised his constituents that he was ready to distribute weapons to arm them if the Taliban were to attack his province in central Afghanistan. And we should know there are already pre-existing militias in Bamyan funded by other sources.
Yeah,
so you have militias that are funded by local leaders, local strong. Yep.
Local strongmen, and it brings us back to those images we saw at the outset that were filmed by Mortaza. So if everyone and anyone is now getting weapons for the fights to come, well, it sort of feels as though there's like a completely different universe in which the Afghan president went to Washington last week, Ashraf Ghani, in the company of his power-sharing partner / rival Abdullah Abdullah. They were welcomed to Capitol Hill, the Pentagon, and to the White House.
Afghans are going to have to decide their future, what they want. But it won't be for lack of us being helped. There's going to be and the senseless violence that has to stop, but it's going to be very difficult. But we're going to stick with you, and we're going to do our best to see to it you have the tools you need.
You have the tools you need. Your reaction, Christine Fair.
Well, I'm laughing for several reasons. It doesn't matter how much money we remain committed to giving the Afghans, what our training commitments are, if we do not have a policy to corral Pakistan and to force Pakistan to stop supporting the myriad militant groups that are slaughtering Afghanistan. A few minutes ago...
Let me bring in Jacqueline Hazelton on that.
Actually, I do want to correct something that you said. I've been studying South Asia since 1991. This idea that there are militias in Afghanistan that are backed by India is simply false. This is Pakistani propaganda. Are the Indians engaging intelligence operations? I sure hope so. But there is nothing that India does in Afghanistan that remotely compares to what Pakistan does, not only through the Taliban, but also through the Haqqani network, which is probably one of the most vicious assets that Pakistan has at its disposal.
Let me bring in Jacqueline Hazelton. On this. Jacqueline Hazelton, when you hear Joe Biden say you have the tools you need, what's your reaction?
My reaction is that Afghanistan does not have the tools it needs, and after 20 years of Western support, it still does not have the tools it needs, and that tells me that another 20 years would not help Afghanistan gain the tools it needs. This is a very typical situation for a Western military intervention.
I was going to say, and when you hear Christine Fair saying the solution is to up the pressure on Pakistan, your reaction?
My reaction to that is that it would be lovely if the Afghans had no one interfering in their state, but the fact is that there are many other states interfering, and that's pretty typical. If the United States has not figured out within the past 20 years how to force Pakistan to do the U.S. bidding in Afghanistan, I don't see what further it can possibly do to persuade Pakistan that its interests are not what Pakistan thinks they are, but they are what the United States think they are.
Let me bring in for reaction on this, Mortaza Beboudi.
Yeah, what said the President of the United States, Joe Biden? I mean, now the equipments that we have, that Afghanistan has. I went to Bagram Airport. They're destroying, they're scrapping the tons of equipments, vehicles from the army, and they're putting outside.
Because the Afghans were saying when the Soviets left, they left the equipment behind.
No, now they are destroying that. The U.S. Army in Bagram, near to Bagram Airport, they're putting them outside, scrapped everything. And there
why
are
are they doing
that? I don't know. They don't give it to the... why they don't give it to Afghan army or government to use it? Their chairs, office equipments, their cars, vehicles.
Well, who wants to give us the answer? Why is that? Should I put it to you, Christine Fair?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. So the most important reason, first of all, let's talk about what the Russians left behind. If you travel around the Afghan countryside, what you actually see is that the Russians just left their equipment there like junk. So this wasn't some deliberate handoff that was meant to empower Afghans. It was simply abandoned, and it became part of the Afghan countryside. One of the biggest criticisms I have of the U.S. government was that it wanted to basically get the Afghan military to use U.S. weapon systems. The Afghan military reflects the population from which it recruits, and basic literacy is a fundamental problem. Our weapon systems are very difficult to maintain, and the U.S. government did not want to continue the Afghan military's reliance upon Russian-made weapon systems. I think this was a huge mistake. Had the United States been more flexible and less profit-motivated, I think the Afghan military would have been much better served by continuing to use Russian weapon systems. They're much easier to maintain. They're not as finicky per the environment. And we also have partners that can provide very inexpensively these Russian-made systems. And most importantly, we have partners like India that can train the Afghan military to use these weapon systems appropriately and to maintain them. So this, I think, was an enormous opportunity that the United States consistently missed over 20 years. And it wasn't as if people were not making that criticism.
Jacqueline Hazelton, your thoughts on the U.S. scrapping its military equipment as it leaves Bagram Air Base?
I think that's an unfortunate message to be sending to the Afghans at this point, when there is a great deal of use and money that could be made out of that material. The larger problem, though, is that the United States tried to create a professional military without the state institutions that are necessary to do so, and that just doesn't work. We've seen it in South Vietnam, we've seen it in El Salvador, we've seen it in Iraq, we've seen it again and again. Creating a professional military without an institutionalized, bureaucratized civilian government simply doesn't work. You have nepotism, you have corruption, you have no payment systems, you have no personnel systems, you have, as Chris mentioned, trouble with logistic systems at both ends of the military problem. What it does and how it gets to do what it does and what it wants, it's simply impossible to get from here to there.
When we come back, we're going to be looking at excerpts from Margot Ben's exclusive report, Inside Taliban Country. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're wondering what next for Afghanistan. The final U.S. pullout of ground forces is a matter of weeks, perhaps even days, and we're talking about it with Kabul correspondent Margot Ben. Thank you for being with us. Thanks as well to Afghan journalist Mortaza Behboudi, Christine Fair, professor of security studies at Georgetown University in Washington, and from Newport, Rhode Island, Jacqueline Hazelton, assistant professor of defense and security strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College. To find Taliban country, well, Margot Ben and Solène Chalvon-Fioretti didn't have to go very far from Kabul. Under escort from the insurgents, you visited a village they control in nearby Wardak province.
Taliban areas, the rare women with university diplomas often come from larger, government-controlled cities and are employed in the health sector. Like here at the clinic. Behind this curtain, the waiting space for female patients. The Taliban have ever so slightly relaxed their policies on women's health.
Are you ill? Come and have a seat.
Sorha Sidikat regularly comes here from Kabul and receives patients from all around the valley. 20 years ago, the Taliban would have forbidden her to practice or even study medicine. Today, she heals the wounds and souls of the fighters' wives.
I've lost my appetite. I haven't eaten in 2 days.
Do you have problems at home?
Yes, I do have some problems at home.
What kind of problems? Are you having trouble conceiving a child?
I had a baby, but he died.
Oh, I understand.
You will not say it's your fault that you killed the baby because you didn't take good care of it.
All Afghan women have psychological problems. Not just here. Women don't really go outside much. They don't even hang out amongst each other anymore. In this district in particular, it is true that women have a very difficult life. They're always covered. They don't have any distractions. Does this hurt?
Yes.
What about this?
Yes. It hurts up to here.
Sorha Sidikat is one of the rare women who commutes between Kabul and Omar Khail. On the way, neither the Afghan army nor the Taliban stop her. A tacit understanding between the two enemies allows a safe passage of medical personnel.
On the day I arrived, the Taliban asked to see my medical degree. They read it carefully and double-checked with the university in Kabul that I had indeed graduated from there. Only then did they hire me. In Kabul, I don't wear a fully face veil, but here I need to wear it outside my practice. It's how things are. If I didn't wear it, people might think that I come here to put bad ideas in women's mind and encourage immodesty.
When the Taliban were in power in the 90s, women couldn't see male doctors. In short, they were barred from any access to healthcare.
Margot Ben, it was striking in that report. You mentioned at one time inside of it how you didn't see any women out on the street the whole time you were in that village.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, for the whole time that we spent there in that village, we hardly ever saw, I mean, the only women that we ever saw were in this domestic sphere, so in the homes of people that we visited and in the clinic with the female doctor and her patients. But yeah, no, women weren't very visible outside. But I should say that this is also the case in many other areas of Afghanistan, very remote areas, very conservative areas, where women's rights are quite restricted and where, for cultural, traditional reasons, women are kept inside the house mostly, for the most part.
Now, it was a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what the locals thought of the Taliban. We saw, for instance, one elder who invited them in for tea, who talked about the time that U.S.-backed government forces came in and killed some of his family members. And we also saw a grocer saying how the city's safe and he's able to keep his store open longer.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, many people have very diverging views about the Taliban in Afghanistan. The thing that we really have to understand, that we really try to stress in the report, is that when people say that they like the Taliban because they live under their control, they often say rather that they don't appreciate what the government has done for them. So either they have been victims of government strikes or U.S. strikes, or they've been victims of government workers' corruption, or witnessed or have indeed been victims of violence on the part of governmental force. And so they find in the Taliban people who are from their villages, from their areas, and who claim to protect them. But it's very important also to stress that many people, have very heavy grievances against the Taliban, and that they continue to perpetrate massacres across the country, including against civilians, despite what they claim in their very polished communication campaigns, where they say that they never, or they strive not to make any civilian casualties during combat. That's absolutely not true.
Mortaza Behboudi, the numbers vary, but the estimate is that at least 1/3 of the casualties during these past 20 years have been attributed to forces on the government side. And yeah, there's this sort of feeling that how you feel about the Taliban depends on your personal experience.
Of course, I mean, I'm coming from the Wardak province. I'm original. I was born there. Okay. I was 2 years old. My family had to leave the province because it was 1996. My feeling, I mean, what I knew, what I talk about the politician, also I'm contacting the national advisor of a president or security one. I talked 2 weeks ago with. We had more than 100,000 casualties since 2006 in Afghanistan from this U.S. strikes in Afghanistan. Of course, I mean, we talk with the Kandahari people south of Afghanistan. They're saying, okay, we need Taliban also. I mean, in Iraq also, we need. They don't know to who trust. I mean, they cannot trust to Americans. They cannot trust the government, of course, and also now, I mean, the Taliban are taking over the region. They are working there. More than 80% of Afghan people working in agriculture. There, they have homes. They are used to work. They cannot come to Kabul or big cities and find a job. That's a problem, and they want to live there in the region, and they're occupied by Taliban, and they need to trust Taliban, the first thing. And after, we talk about militia, Afghan militia. Afghan militia, we see, okay, the war is not a solution, but it works. They took back the districts in Afghanistan. Okay, I mean, U.S. government, they didn't train well the Afghan army, equipments. And Taliban, they have a drone now. They are, bombs, strikes. Sometimes, journalists have been killed, civilians, other people, and nobody claimed that. Nobody take the responsibility. And this is very scary. Who's doing this? Daesh, Taliban, who?
Right. It's difficult to know. War works in the sense that...
I also wanted to add... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Margot.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to briefly add to what Mortaza was very justly saying, that many Afghans who live in Taliban-controlled areas or near Taliban-controlled areas actually, have this deep feeling of injustice because they have been left out by the government. The many of the development projects that were implemented in Afghanistan were not implemented in many of these remote places, these remote countrysides. A lot of the money that has been injected into Afghanistan over the past 20 years has been directed at Kabul or the large cities that now have nice roads and somewhat functioning infrastructure. But a lot of these countrysides don't have that. So there are these grievances. And there's also a sense of, lack of trust in the central government. For instance, what we showed in our report as well is that the justice system, I believe, is the second or third, I think it's the second most corrupt institution in Afghanistan. And what the Taliban claim that they have to offer is a functional justice system that's very expeditive, that functions according to Sharia law, Islamic law. And so some people actually come to Taliban areas to seek justice rather than going to the central institutions in Kabul, to the justice system of the, piloted by the central government, because that will take many years. The process will take many years. It's very corrupt. And if you don't know the right people, basically you cannot achieve justice in Afghanistan. So basically the Taliban filled that vacuum that has been left by misused funds and rampant corruption, nepotism, and a dysfunctional government. That's very important to know, is that the people don't necessarily like or appreciate the Taliban or their overall ideology or what they have done in the past 20 years, but they just see them as a somewhat functioning government for their village or their area.
Of course, I'm totally agree with you. We are very courageous in going to those districts and talking to Taliban. But at the same time, yes, there is injustice, there is corruption, very corrupted country in the government. But we see how money is coming for the Promote project, empowering the women in Afghanistan, 2015. How many, thousands of millions of dollars coming for this project and giving them to Afghan government, and Afghan government going to do what? For empowerment of women, giving them to those NGOs, local NGOs working on, and there is no reports. And also those NGOs, they're saying that we did in the districts and villages in Wardak, in Herat district in south of Afghanistan. They did it by what was the fault? The fault of that they give it only for women. They didn't educated men.
Yeah,
in
Jacqueline Hazelton, and we see it in Margot Ben's report. There is the resentment of the big city in Afghanistan, and the fact that there is this sense that the money never did trickle down. We've been talking about that on this show for years. And as you said in part one of our discussion, they're leaving after 20 years, the Americans. This could have gone on for another 20 years, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And the reason that the Taliban has been able to take and keep territory and rule over it, even before the U.S. presence, going back to the birth of the Taliban in the 90s, the great thing that it has been able to provide is some reduction in the uncertainty involved in living in a civil war. So the Taliban, whether you like their version of justice or not, provides some sort of stability in a country that's been at war for decades, well before the United States entered the war with combat troops. The problem that civilians face in this situation is a menu of bad options. You cooperate with who you have to cooperate with to stay alive, to do whatever business you do, to travel from one area to another. And none of that necessarily means political support for one armed actor or another. It means you're just trying to stay alive.
All right, so let me ask you this. The United Nations reports how poppy production jumped 37% in 2020. This is in the nation responsible for, 90% of the world's production in opium and the heroin that is derived from it. So, Jacqueline, we talked about the U.S. breaking its military equipment before leaving. Should they be somehow destroying the poppy fields?
This is a decision that the U.S. military has struggled with for years. If you destroy the poppy fields, you alienate the poppy farmers and everyone who's involved in economic and personal relationships with them. And if you believe, as the United States does, that in order to defeat an insurgency, you need to gain popular support, then the last thing you want to do is alienate this populace. So you're on the horns of a dilemma. And the United States has remained on those horns since the beginning.
Christine Fair, you agree?
I think the opium issue is just too complicated to have a meaningful discussion in this time frame. I think in general, I agree with Hazelton, but I find this notion that the Taliban provides some insurance against civil war to be so risible. I'm unable to politely comment upon it. The Taliban are the source of the problem. And I also want to speak a little bit about the justice issue. This idea that the Taliban have been providing justice, this has been sort of like the standard pablum talking points now for most of this conflict. But you know what? There's actually no evidence for it. I mean, there have been discussions about the Taliban mobile justice vehicles that come in. They're sort of like roving Sharia courts. These are rumors. There's not a lot of evidence for it. Well, let me finish, sir. I've actually listened very patiently to the absurdities of others. What seems to be the Taliban's bailiwick, incidentally, we also see this in Pakistan. They're not solving complicated cases. They're solving cases that are relatively simple. For example, if someone doesn't have an arranged marriage, or if someone runs off with another person's daughter, if someone accidentally kills a piece of livestock, or a tree falls on someone's houses. These are the kinds of cases that the Taliban are resolving. And for a lot of rural Afghans, that's actually enough. But you really have to understand, in some cases, the brutality with which these cases are resolved. So if a boy runs off with another family's girl, the Taliban may issue a judgment that girl's family's men get to go and rape the women of the offending boy's household, right? So I really, when we talk about this justice fetish that so many Western analysts have with the Taliban without a lot of ground experience or, quite frankly, evidence, this, I think, really creates an illusion that the Taliban want us to create on its behalf. This is, I will say, it's a story. There's not a lot of evidence for it. And I've been going to Afghanistan now for well over a decade. What people will say is that what the U.S. has brought is freedoms without security. And what they got under the Taliban was predictable security. But
Without
this isn't
freedom.
a choice. Yes, right. Security without freedom. And I think when you're just talking about your kids going out, whether your daughters are going to be assaulted, at some point, security for many people, it's going to trump freedom, especially when those freedoms are really seen as sort of bourgeois affectations in the cities, when so many Afghans live their lives outside of urban areas.
All right, let me bring in Margot Ben on this, because we do see in your report one of these tribunals sitting outside under a tree. And I got to ask you, because in that case, following up on what Christine Fair said, it was two of the men were being judged for firing their weapons in the air. So these are small charges. And the sentence was that they were disarmed for a while. My question to you, Margot, is how much did you feel was playing for the camera, because you were filming this, of course?
Well, for one, there wasn't any playing for the camera, because we actually almost didn't manage to film this, and we actually were very, very lucky to be there at that moment. And this is not at all something that had been predicted, for us. And we actually managed to film this, and it was pretty difficult to get. So there wasn't any playing around for the camera. What I would like to say is that, of course, it is needed to stress how brutal Taliban justice is, and very few people actually, discredit this. But even though it's extremely brutal, I think the Taliban have successfully maintained that illusion that you were talking about, that illusion of justice and that illusion of functional justice. Because indeed, in the cities and the justice system offered by the central government is dysfunctional, and it relies on corruption and nepotism and who you know. And so, even though that justice, that the Taliban justice is also somewhat dysfunctional, because it relies on a lot of brutality. It doesn't follow the Afghan constitution. It gives the illusion of a quick process and of justice for those who seek justice and a result. And the types of cases that are solved are not only family cases, which indeed are form a large part of the cases that are solved, but also land issues. And those land issues are very, very important in Afghanistan, both in the countryside and the cities. Many people, because there was no official, record really kept in Afghanistan of who owns what land. There are a lot of points of contentions between families, between clans, between people, and the Taliban, at least claim to be able to solve those cases because they are from there and they are not, dominated by corruption and nepotism. Whether they are or not, I cannot say.
Right.
I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying they maintain that illusion, and they have successfully maintained that illusion of an expeditive justice that functions according to Islam. And a lot of people have, and I met people who actually cross over to Taliban areas to seek justice because they prefer that than going to Kabul.
Let me just, because Mortaza Behboudi, we're out of time.
Okay.
But let me just ask you this question before we go. At the outset, I asked, will history repeat itself? So if the Taliban do take Kabul, is it back to the way it was before 2001?
Never. Well, Taliban can take Kabul, because now, we see that the Kabul security, of course, the district, they are taken by the Taliban, but in Kabul itself, they are Daesh. They are doing a strike, of course, and Taliban also. But no, we will never. We do not have to forget. When I said civilians, people, women, achievements, what they do. We have entrepreneurs. Mina, one of the brave women.
So you're saying we won't return to the way it was before 2001. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we're out of time. But I want to thank you so much, Mortaza Behboudi. I want to thank as well Christine Fair, Jacqueline Hazelton for being with us from Newport, Rhode Island, Margot Ben, and if you haven't seen it yet, it's from Reporters, the France 24 investigative news magazine, Margot's full report on what it's like inside of Taliban country. You can find it on our website, france24.com.